Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. It is Thursday, May 1st. Rodney's still trekking in Malta, so I figured I'd take an opportunity to interview for a second time a friend of ours for a long time, another friend of ours at Fastmarkets, Andrea Hotter, who is a special correspondent, having worked at Fastmarkets for some 12 years. A special correspondent means she's mainly a journalist covering a whole host of things in the commodity space. So we will entitle this, as we did last time, it may be Hotter Commodities 2, to cover not just lithium, because lithium is anything but hot at the moment, but we will cover that a bit. Before getting into a series of topics and catch up with Andrea, just want to mention we interviewed Casper Rawls of Benchmark Minerals last week about the Intercontinental Exchange's derivatives contract using benchmark indexes. But in addition to that, Fast Markets and Intercontinental Exchange have exchange contracts as well. So they launched 8, 4 of which with BMI, 4 of which are with Fast Markets. The Fast Markets contracts are a lithium hydroxide futures contract, a carbonate futures contract, and a spodumene contract that's CIF China, which is a little bit different than the FOB Australia of benchmark index, and also a cobalt contract. But we'll be speaking with Presmek Korolewski and Will Adams next week to talk about these derivatives contracts and also Fast Markets lithium supply, demand, and pricing outlook. So make sure to tune into that when we have that discussion next week. One other thing I'll flag is I will be at the Fast Markets flagship industry conference. I think it's the 17th annual lithium supply and battery materials conference in Las Vegas. It's from June 23rd to the 26th. Highly recommend all of our viewers to attend that. And if you do come to that, please give me a ring and you'll see Rodney and I there alongside Andrea. And finally, Andrea started as part of her special correspondency, entering the podcast world last year with a podcast called Fast Forward. I don't know how many episodes there have been, but if you want to listen to her guests and interviewing interviews, tune in to, I think it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and every other major podcast platform. And you can follow Andrea at Andrea Hotter on X as well. And with that intro out of the way, Andrea, you've had a very busy couple of months. We've all having vertigo and whiplash, trying to keep track of the flood. It's now 100 days of Trump. We have some topics here. I noticed you're at the SAFE Summit. This is Securing America's Future Energy. That's a group we've interviewed, uh, um, way back when in 2018, but has evolved very significantly. This is a Washington-based advocacy group. Why don't you start with that? I think that was last month or earlier. Yeah, it was in April or late March. What were the key topics in Washington, D.C., and your key takeaways, from that conference?
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. By the way, thank you, Howard, for that intro, and good to be here. It was a really interesting time. I mean, the last day of the conference was actually Liberation Day when the reciprocal tariffs were announced. So everybody had kind of been anticipating that, waiting for it, and then were glued to their screens as those came out. But the biggest takeaway for me was the change in approach to critical minerals. It was a great event. There were dozens and dozens, thousands of people there, dozens of companies in our space. But gone are those references to the energy transition or to climate change or ESG. I don't think anybody mentioned that. It's all about energy security and national security now. So that was a really, really interesting swing. We expected it, you seeing it throughout the executive orders we've seen and so on, but it was really interesting to see that the companies also are speaking in this way and not referencing the energy transition or climate in the way that they used to be. I moderated a session on lithium on the stage, And in the briefing notes that I was provided at the beginning, there wasn't a mention once of the word electric vehicle either, which I thought was really fascinating. It was all about batteries, but for defense, military applications, and so on, energy storage. That was very much where the focus was. So that to me was a huge change from if I think back just a year ago, 6 months ago, for sure.
Yeah, which says a lot, I guess. Just the narrative has changed, right? One administration to the other, and the various constituencies in our industry have to shift narrative to fit the moment. So, what that we've seen a lot today, it was announced a Ukraine, or yesterday was announced a Ukraine deal. Trump is in wants to go to Greenland. He's negotiating peace in the DRC with Rwanda, and there's hope, maybe there'll be some minerals aspects over there. He's had a bunch of executive orders, which we'll talk about. But let's just going back. So you had a lithium. You moderated a lithium panel. Who is on that panel?
So that was SQM, ExxonMobil, which is obviously now big oil in lithium, and Hatch actually. So that was more about what do we need to do to get this industry sort of caught up to where China was. And the good news I think that came out of it was the message that we can do it. It's not impossible. The technology is there. The technology that the Chinese used was initially developed by us. It's just been improved on, but we can get there. Um, but what I thought was really interesting as a theme throughout every panel that I was watching was the response from companies outside of the States. So this would include the South Korean and the Japanese companies, but also the Chilean, the Canadian companies. There was a real push to say, please keep the good parts. Please keep the Inflation Reduction Act. Please keep the 45X credit. Don't turn away from us. We're your allies. We want to work in the US. Let me give you an example. LG Chem. They obviously, as you know, invested in Tennessee State, the first ever cathode plant in the US. I think it's the single biggest piece of foreign direct investment in Tennessee. So really important to the state as well. They were really, really pushing the fact that tariffs are going to cause them huge burden. They said that now the statistic was crazy, to import steel for machinery and equipment that they can't source in the US to build that plant is going to cost another over $3 million on top of the 35 plus $1 million that they're already spending on that steel. So they called for materials being used in the construction of projects in the US to be exempt from tariffs. So they were highlighting those kind of knock on effects of the tariffs. Um, they were talking about government support is really essential in this midstream piece in lithium because it's really expensive to build in the US and all of this policy uncertainty isn't helping. The cost to build in Tennessee, they said, is 3 times more than it is of an identical plant in South Korea and 5 times more expensive than one in China. So that, again, another really interesting stat when you put it into perspective. How many manufacturing plants are we going to see in the US if the cost is so expensive to build them? Um, I could go on. I've got lists of all of these companies that were talking about SQM. Please, we're open to partnerships outside Chile. We're looking particularly in the US because of the tariffs, but also aware of the fact that there can be knock-on effects of these throughout the supply chain. ExxonMobil, on the panel I was on, they said that they think that the National Energy Dominance Council is a really good first step. So are the executive orders. They acknowledge that we're years behind, but they think the potential's there. But they said we need a level playing field. So there's this kind of tiptoe dance going on, I think, between companies inside and outside the US to make sure that they are doing the right things in terms of what the administration requires, but also externally, companies saying, hang on, we are your allies, we are your partners, we do still want to invest in the US. Just please don't tariff us out of business. So it was a really interesting situation, and I can't imagine really how it must have felt to be one of those companies thinking, I'm going to invest, and then finding that day that their reciprocal tariffs were suddenly, at 40+%. I know that's changed since, but that must have been a real kind of moment of kind of woof, just to see that happening. So it was a really, really interesting time, and I'm sure it hasn't changed.
Right. Okay. And this was like a month ago, so Liberation Day. A
Yeah.
lot has changed. He's back down on some of the tariffs and the rhetoric, and there
Mhm.
was a cabinet meeting yesterday, and Besant and Lutnick have been talking about, deals i- imminent. We don't know with who yet, but how is it, like, apart from the people who were speaking there, were there a lot of government, legislators and others in the audience? And what do you think their receptivity to the arguments that the South Korean, Japanese, and SQM were making?
Yeah, I think that yes, there were a lot of policymakers there, whether they were senators, people on their teams, whether they were lots of people from Congress. It was a very well attended event, and an exceptionally good lineup of people from that kind of contingency of DC. Um, I think there was very much a theme and a message. If you were a Republican on stage, you were most definitely um pushing and promoting the agenda of the administration. I think that it was interesting. There were a couple of people who were Democrats who were also similarly saying, look, we really support the development of critical minerals. It's not that we don't. We just want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. So I think there was and is bipartisan support for development. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act and so on were developed in the last administration. I think there was a real push, though, that was really interesting, and a fear maybe about what's gonna happen to some of the projects in terms of the financing. A lot of people I spoke to said that maybe the government needs to stop thinking like a bank and become private equity in a way to speed up loans and access to capital, and that could be one way of really kick-starting things. We've obviously seen this the executive orders, say that there will be faster financing now from Exim Bank, the International Development Finance Corporation. That will help. The Defense Production Act as well, that now has a fund, but it's small. It's less than $1 billion. So it's not a huge amount of money. So there's got to be something else. But I think there's a real feeling that the government will push ahead with grants where the corporates participate. So it's not free money. From what I understand, subsequent to being there as well, there has been talk of equity participation by the government, which I thought was really interesting. But the issue that I see with that is that some of these projects are juniors and giving away, I don't know, 30%, 10% even of their capital. That doesn't really raise enough money because they're small at the moment. So I think grants are still going to have to happen. Um, you know, Smackover, obviously, I spoke with them quite recently and they said they re-engaged with the DOE over its grant for Southwest Arkansas. Um, I'm not worried about that project. It just got that special designation as a priority transparency critical mineral project. So I actually think that that will be absolutely fine. We just saw American Battery Technology Co. get that letter of interest from Exim Bank. I think that's 900 million or so, and that's a lithium mine and hydroxide refinery in Nevada. You've got that. You've got those other projects, three of them, obviously Southwest Arkansas, but Silver Peak, an expansion, and Gingerly Lithium's McDermott exploration project. So three of them were lithium. That space seems to be recognized as an area where the US does definitely need to improve. Um, Thacker Pass as well, over $2 billion, 2.26, I think. So I think these things are happening. What I'm curious, and maybe you've got a view on this as well, Howard, is what happens to those projects that were waiting and hoping? Are they going to have that money coming through? Or is there going to be more money in the pot to distribute through the original sort of loans programs that we saw? I think that's the bit of the question mark at the moment. Future.
There are lots of question marks. It's right. You're right. The Exim Bank, we noted this client of ours, Lithium Ionic, received a letter of interest from the US Exim Bank, I guess, I don't know, late last year, and this was after kind of September, the UN, Climate Week, et cetera, under Biden. They really, the Exim Bank is a new entity in the critical mineral space as a lender. Um, but these are just so they've been very fast to write LOIs. They haven't yet executed any deals, to my knowledge. You're right, the Defense Production Act, those are generally smaller checks. The loan programs office is obviously huge, and we interviewed Ashley's on what Forbes, and you mentioned the Southwest Arkansas project. They're confident they'll get it, but it's still a question mark. I'm confident they'll get it as well, um, but it there's just been a lot of conflicting signals sent, right? As soon as Trump came in, he said, let's review everything, right? So that kind of slowed things down. I listened to a podcast yesterday that they're prospectively going to reduce the staff at the loan programs office at the Department of Energy by half, which, if they do that, could slow the progress on a
Mhm.
lot of loans. And they also indicated, as part of their coal executive order, that the loan programs office, they're making coal, I think, a critical mineral,
Right.
and it may be available to get loans from the loan programs office, for coal projects. So there's there is a whole of government approach here, and I think more money will be applied to critical minerals of many types, but where's the emphasis, right? There's defense, there's rare earths, there's seabed mining, which you wrote about, so we could talk about that. But I'm just a little bit worried. I'm not hearing a lot about batteries, electric vehicles, lithium. Those words aren't coming from the mouths of Secretary Burgum or Secretary Wright, but what is coming from their mouth is nuclear uh, energy. Talk about energy a lot. They talk about baseload energy a lot. They talk about natural gas and LNG. Uh,
Mhm.
so I just don't know, right? And Trump always is anti-wind. He's mixed message about solar. Yes, he showcased Tesla's electric vehicles at the White House, one day, but you're not hearing a lot about EVs. And then Tesla itself is more focused on autonomy and robots, and
Mhm.
there's lithium and battery materials that go in that. So I just don't know,
Yeah. I think
where it's going to land.
that's where I think the external piece comes in, that the LG Chems and the SK-ons and so ons of the world, who are probably the ones who are thinking, we're the missing piece to the jigsaw puzzle here. We'll come in and develop this processing, but please make it viable for us. A lot of those projects that you mentioned, you're absolutely right. The 10 that got that kind of fast tracking on the permitting side, or special priority, they are obviously mining projects. They're not. There is a processing plant for potash, I believe, but the rest of them are all mining projects. The coal ones are, I think it's Warrior Met Coal in Alabama that you mentioned. So, but then you look at certain areas that are going to really potentially take off from this as well. Alaska. Um, that has is so mineral rich, and it's in kind of a sweet spot right now. The Alaskan state governor, Mike Dunleavy, is very pro natural resources. Apart from being a Republican who has a very good relationship with the president, his wife actually comes from a major mining region, and his daughters work in the mining sector. So he knows a lot about the mining industry, and I think that we'll start to see things in Alaska really, really push ahead now. Um, at that Safe Summit, one of the companies that was there was Tech Resources. Now they own the Red Dog zinc and lead mine. They're Canadian. They own this mine in Alaska. It's one of the biggest in the world. They've been trying to extend its mine life. It took 6 years to get a permit to extend the road by 6 miles.
Jesus. Yeah.
Let that sink in, because
Yeah.
that to me is not, we're not going to get anywhere if we take that long to do anything. So 6 years. So that's a big problem. big, big problem. There's a major nickel project by Alaska Energy Metals called Nikolai, which is a massive nickel sulfide project, sort of quite in the interior, but south of Fairbanks. The CEO, I interviewed him. He first worked on it. He found it, worked on it 30 years ago. It's gone through various owners, but it's been a victim of price cycles for nickel. So it's started. No, it's not going to happen. It's happening. It's not happening. The current owner, the CEO now, picked it up in 2023. Apart from the price cycle, because of this backdrop, now they're much more optimistic that things will go ahead because they hope that financing will come. So there is there's something's got to be done on permitting, whether it's, I think we need to think out the box a little bit. Permit a project maybe from mine to processing through the supply chain in one process, like in Indonesia. How about investing more in the infrastructure side? If it takes 6 years to develop a road 6 miles, we need more private public investment partnerships. Maybe that's the way. Leverage the existing strengths we've got. We've got this capacity already in production. There was a lot of talk about this, and I know we've discussed this previously. Teck is refining tailings at the Trail refinery to produce antimony and germanium and indium, things that we need in the US. Rio Tinto's refining waste streams to produce scandium in Quebec, and I think it's tellurium at its copper operations in Utah. Freeport is leaching its copper stockpiles in Arizona and producing enough within, I think by the end of 2026, it will be three small size mines. So it's a huge opportunity to rethink the way that we're doing things, not just speed up permitting, but think about how we do things differently. And it's great this focus is there, but you're right. I think the core challenge for mining is time, but the challenge for processing is this lack of domestically produced feedstock and the economics and competitiveness of facilities. So unless we change all of those pieces, they're kind of chicken and egg. Um, and I think that's very much recognized within the industry, and I hope it's recognized sort of further up. Um, and the really good news is they've obviously appointed a mining czar. Effectively, that's not the title being given. He's, I believe, overseeing the Energy Dominance Council, but his name's David Copley, and he came from Newmont, so he understands mining. So that's a really positive change to have somebody in charge of all of this who we'll call him the mining czar, but who sounds like he's going to really know the industry well. Gold, copper, etc. Newmont, big company, understands the challenges. I think that's a good thing for the industry, definitely.
Yep. You mentioned the two important, things. Yeah, you need the permitting, and I think, but then you also need, the incentives on the supply chain. So that goes to, the IRA and the 45X, the tax credits to incentivize midstream investment. As we talk about kind of like battery supply chain, and you mentioned a lot of, companies doing interesting stuff with the unpronounceable rare earths that, the people don't know a lot about, out of tailings, et cetera. So where, so just on the permitting side, I think this was an executive order or something else where they basically said there are two types of, I think it's NEPA or, on public land, you have in environmental assessment, right? And then you have an
Mhm.
environmental impact statement, right? An environmental
Mhm.
assessment was always 1 year, right? And the environmental impact statement was like a 2 year process, right? So it was a
Right.
more substantive. And the executive order said they're going to shorten that um, EA from 1 year to I think 1 month, right?
Right.
And the
Yeah.
EIS from 2 years to 2 months. Now, I've seen some chatter that like there's no way that would be contested in the courts to actually usurp legislation. Like it would be hard for me to fathom something that takes typically 2 years, a very major project, that would get through in 2 months. But it does show the bias on the administration's part to get stuff permitted and not get a 6 mile road take 6 years as it did in
Right.
Alaska. I
Mhm.
don't know about that nickel project in Alaska, but I know there is Northern Dynasty, a giant copper project in
Pebble. Yep.
Alaska. And so I do wonder, is the government looking at minerals and say, hey, which ones, do we really need to focus on? Where is there a critical supply gap? And copper, I think, definitely looks like one that they need to support. And I know Ivanhoe Electric has a project in the US. They also announced, I think, a week or two ago, an LOI with the Exim Bank. Uh, but how do they view nickel, right?
Yeah.
And yes, we're overly reliant on Indonesia, and China controls Indonesia, but Indonesia is a relatively friendly country to the United States. Uh, and then how important again is nickel for the defense industry or the EV industry? How important is the EV industry, like in the mind of the government? So when they're looking at all of these specific minerals to fast track and to prospectively
Mhm.
write an equity check to, and you're mentioning this equity check is very important. I mentioned it in one of my earlier videos. Doug Burgum said, he's the Department of Interior Secretary and the chairman of this economics, energy dominance council, whatever you want to call it, with Chris Wright. He said that we're looking at equity checks, we're looking at stockpiling, and we're looking at political risk insurance, for certain projects. When he talked about equity, you're saying, oh, a junior is like a really small project, and giving government equity would be, maybe too dilutive. But, the approach of the Biden administration with Lithium Americas was to write a huge, as you said, $2.3 billion debt check, right? But then have to
Mhm.
find the equity alongside that. In some cases, some projects, I mean, the government funded a solar project, Tonopah Solar. If it goes bankrupt, the government takes it over anyway, right? From an equity point of view. But I think, uh, it'll be interesting to like equity is good, right? It's not like
Mhm.
if it comes at a reasonable valuation, because having so much debt on a project can weigh down, the equity owners return, while
For
they're
sure.
building a project, is it going to be late? Is it going to be over budget, et cetera? So it would be really interesting. This hasn't been, he just announced this on CNBC. It was a discussion. It's under consideration. But if all of a sudden there was a government vehicle, they're talking about having a sovereign wealth fund. If there was a
Mhm.
government vehicle that could write $1 billion equity checks or $500 million equity checks for select projects partnered with public equity, that could be very interesting. But which projects are they going to prioritize, and how do they assess, right, the economics of that project? So you were mentioning, I don't know this Alaska project you were talking about, but there's a lot of low grade nickel projects in Canada, for example. And we've been, working with this metals company, which has a super high grade nickel and copper project, but it's on the seabed, right? And they
Mhm.
now have like $1.5 billion, $2 billion valuation. If they were to get permitted and the government were to write like an equity check into that project, I'm not saying that they're going to do that, but that's doable. That's like creating a new industry, an offshore mining industry, like the offshore oil industry was created. I don't know how many decades ago. So
Mhm.
anyway, talk about the seabed. I think you wrote about it or interviewed someone in connection with that, uh, and we can.
Yeah, yeah. I do want to just comment on what you said about the permitting timeframes, the approvals of the environmental side. One of the big messages, and I thought it was really interesting, at CESCO, during CESCO, which is the big copper industry week in Santiago, Chile, all the big majors on their main panel sat there and said, and I'm talking, Anglo American, Rio Tinto, etc., sat there and said, we're all for faster permitting. We think we've been crying out for that for absolutely years, but we do not want it at the risk of, to the detriment of, bad environmental damage and doing, having encouraging bad actors into the sector who do things in a sloppy manner that doesn't, which will only kind of come back on and hit us in the face eventually because it's not going to be good for the communities and so on. I think the second piece of that is it, the challenges, as you said, to that in terms of the legal challenges will just come hard and fast. So I think things would get tied up in the courts in the same way anyway. So trying to fast track something in a month that takes 2 years, there's got to be a better process than there is, but it's got to be done in the right way and like to avoid those kinds of challenges. And some of these projects have not happened because they've been tied up in legislation for absolutely decades. You mentioned Pebble. That's like, it's 20 plus years. It's
Yeah.
incredible. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. Seabed mining, my gosh, yes, it sounded like a kind of a crazy thing 20 years ago. It would have sounded like mining on the moon, but hey, we're talking about both of those now. So, well, there was an executive order, wasn't there? Last week, I think it was.
Yeah.
I think we're still in, yeah, last week. Everything's moving so quickly, which was focused on fast tracking exploration and mining licenses and mapping out the continental shelf of the US and determining the commercial opportunities. And I think it also talked about stockpiling seabed minerals as well. So, the seabed, as we know, contains that nickel and the manganese and the copper and the cobalt and some rare earths and precious metals, etc. You also mentioned the metals company. That's a really interesting situation at the moment. I don't know how much you've talked about seabed mining here on your podcast before, but obviously the kind of the backstory is the seabed has been run by in the international waters. It's been run by effectively an organization called the International Seabed Authority, which was set up by the UN. And it's granted a lot of exploration licenses, including to the metals company that you mentioned, but it hasn't yet created a mining code for international waters. And I think that basically this has all come at a very interesting time because TMC, which is obviously Vancouver based, got really vexed by what it's seen as a complete lack of progress in the regulation of seabed mining. And it backed away from the international governmental organization, which was effectively the regulator, the ISA, and started to engage with White House officials. And now it's started a process with, got to get this right, US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration seeking federal approval for commercial deep sea mining operations in international waters, effectively bypassing the ISA. And it wants to do it really quickly. And given the background of this executive order, it sounds like it could happen really quickly. So, in some ways, great. That's a fantastic development. The argument against it, as you can imagine, there's been over the years, a lot of opposition to seabed mining from groups, environmental groups. And I think that kind of explains the very sort of slow approach to um, the mining code, making sure they get it right. People are worried about irreversible damage to the ecosystems, the marine ecosystems. I know that's something that the commercial interests active in seabed mining completely refute. Um, but you do have also other opposition. Some European automotive companies have said that they won't buy materials sourced from deep sea mining in their products. So that was kind of interesting. And there are some sort of more kind of, I guess, investor concerns around this, depending on where you fit into the ESG sort of argument at the moment, probably more European than US at the moment. Um, so it's a really interesting kind of topic. When I wrote about it, there were a lot of people who I posted it on X, Twitter X, and the general theme was, oh my gosh, how are we going to solve mineral shortages by stripping the mining floor? Because what could possibly go wrong, I think was something that somebody said. So it's a really interesting development. Where I think it will potentially have real legs are in these exclusive economic zones. Um, these are the national jurisdictions. So you've got the Cook Islands have their own EEZs, and there's a company called CIC Limited that's exploring there. These are the kind of areas where you might start to see more work being done as EEZs start to look around. Now, that was something that the executive order talked about. It said we would like to partner with other nations not just in the US continental shelf, but in your jurisdiction. So that doesn't necessarily breach anything or cause any problems with the ISA. Um, you've got Kiribati, one of the Pacific nation islands, is has a deal with China, which has a 5-year deal. It struck, I believe, in February to study the seabed there. I don't think it's got any exploration or mining license at the moment, but that could be a way for companies to start to really be a little bit more active. So it's a really interesting kind of situation at the moment. It's a little bit thorny. It's not without controversy. I think it's going to depend on how countries react to offers of partnership with the US. Um, if TMC proves to be kind of a poster child for seabed mining, you might see, these the floodgates, with excuse the pun, could open up for the oceans to become a key part of the future mineral supply mix. The companies that are active there are absolutely convinced that this is going to be part of the supply mix. I think it's going to be a case of convincing other people that this isn't a pie in the sky kind of idea. It's not like mining in outer space. It is a serious part of the solution to the problem. So kind of watch this space a little bit. It's really interesting. I wouldn't mind a trip to the Cook Islands to go and check it out. I'm quite happy to volunteer for that.
Well, you and me both. I agree with you. I way back when, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, there was another company called Nautilus Minerals, which we had represented, and they were
I
mining.
remember them.
They were mining. It was seafloor massive sulfides, and that that company was a darling for a while. It ended up going bankrupt. But a problem with seafloor or the massive sulfides, there were much it was harder to do, and the environmental considerations I think were much more substantial. In the case of TMC, where these are like potato-sized nodules, and yes, we have interviewed Craig Chesky, the CFO, a number of times on Rockstock Channel, including last week, and what's very fascinating and interesting about it, why I think there is such great potential, is that these are like crazy high grade, right? Like what
Mm,
matters so the cost of it is going to be cost effective, right?
right.
And you're mining less if you're mining higher grade ore, right?
Yeah.
So and then it's a relative disturbance, right? Like a lot of the arg anyway, I'd encourage our viewers to watch, our
Yeah,
interviews with
I'll go
Craig
back
Chesky
and
and the
yeah.
metals company. But my like, typically a smelter, right, a conversion facility, processing facility needs to be, close to a mine. Otherwise, you're trucking it, long distances. By sucking up these nodules from the seafloor, you can put a processing plant, kind of anywhere. So the mining of it, right, the transport of it, is cheaper. And then the processing of it, because it's so high grade, is also cheaper. And from a disturbance point of view, compared to chopping down a rainforest or putting waste in the tailings dam or into the ocean, as happens
Yep.
in Indonesia, this is more environment. Like the disturbance here to the earth is looks to me, a lot less. And a lot of
Yeah.
and to just like tie it back to what you said in the beginning, no one was talking about ESG and net zero at the Safe Summit. It was all about economic security, right? So for all of the Western the OEMs, which said, "Ooh, we're not going to do seabed mining," a number of them said they're open to it. Tesla said they're open to it. I think
Yeah.
GM said they're open to it. So there's a mix of opinion, but I could easily see an OEM having been against it previously, as a virtue signal, just like they were talking about ESG and sustainability and everything,
Yeah.
last year and 2 years ago. Um, whoever NGOs kind of got to them and say, we want you to announce that you're against seabed mining, right? Like, so there's a lot of conflicting um, motivations here. And then you have
Mhm.
specific countries that might be against it. they might be protecting their own industry, right? Like Chile, a big
Yeah.
copper producer, probably doesn't want more copper to come from the seafloor, right? So
Mhm. Oh,
the
absolutely,
metals
and the
company is
size
saying,
of
let the science, like,
yeah, yeah.
win,
The
right?
and the size of the metals company's project would mean that they probably don't need any nickel production anywhere else. I remember talking to them previously. It's huge, isn't it? And so high grade.
It is huge, and it is high grade, and it could displace other, and other nickel mines that are more expensive and more environmentally damaging might go out of business as a result of this. That's why I was saying, like, when the government thinks about financing an Alaskan project versus, let's say this nickel project
Yeah,
versus projects that they might find in Africa, like who's doing that assessment in the government? Like what mining expertise to invest in these companies and looking at supply demand balances, et cetera. Um,
yeah,
it, very fascinating as always. One other thing we were talking about, Andrea, before we had this call is I was trying to figure out, like, we're very focused, Rock Stock Channel, stocks. We're very focused on how to play public equities in particular
mhm,
tied to certain commodities. And there's a lot of interest in these rare earths. So, is it, suddenly people are asking me, how do I play gallium? How do I play antimony? How do I play beryllium? Like, I don't know how to play those, but everyone keeps coming back to copper. Everyone keeps coming back to nickel. Um, but lithium has matured. So again, going back to the fact that the ICE is now having these derivative contracts, and the CME hydroxide contract has been extremely liquid. Um, and I listened to the Albemarle call today. They've come out with their 2030 forecast. It's a range from 2.5 to 3.3 million tons. At the low end, that's a doubling in 5 years. Lithium still has a lot of companies. And so just in terms of figuring out what um, equities, are liquid enough to kind of play and have a real market, and aren't just like kind of meme stock plays because someone says, oh, I got a gallium discovery and the stock could do well
yeah,
for a short period of time. One way I'm thinking of evaluating is that if it has a forwards market, a futures market, and it's reasonably liquid, like, um, then that's a mature investable commodity. So lithium is moving away from that esoteric, um, small niche market to
right.
mainstream. And copper,
Mhm,
obviously, and nickel, and cobalt's hard, but there's still forwards contracts there. So that's just what one way I'm thinking. If you want to play, gold, obviously, um, iron ore, coal. These, if metals have liquid futures exchanges, then there's a lot of people kind of following them. These other esoteric minerals here and there, you could speculate, and it could be great. I bet you there's some people, now that we've signed a Ukraine deal, you're gonna see some Canadian or Australian junior that's somehow, connected to the Trump administration. They say, "We got an inside deal, to get into this lithium company," and that stock may become a meme stock for a period of time. But I think the prospect of Ukrainian lithium or other projects becoming a source of supply, uh, is well more than 5 years, into the future, probably
yeah,
10.
yeah. It's an interesting one. I mean, you mentioned all of the markets you talked about, antimony, gallium, and all of these rare earths and so on. Well, not just to plug us here, but Fastmarkets has been pricing many of these minor metals for decades. So there is a price history based on this. I mean, you look at antimony prices; they've increased exponentially since the start of the year and over the past year because of the restrictions imposed by China. So that's become a real hot stock at the moment, hot metal. And I think that you you can definitely say to yourself, well, projects that are already up and running, then, those have got to look pretty favorable, right? You're right. There are going to be companies that will be able to say, hey, I mean, my inbox now is just filled with companies I've never heard of when I write about one thing, suddenly I get hundreds of them telling me, "Oh, that I've got this project, it's amazing," you know. So it's and it, you have to be quite, okay, what stage are you at, how long has it been there, you do some due diligence on it. Um, but yeah, you're right. That does happen right now. I think these other smaller markets, they are small. They're much smaller than copper and aluminium and steel and other markets like that. But they are developing, like lithium, in terms of their pricing. We launched actually Thursday, the 1st of May. We launched gadolinium oxide, a price which is a heavy rare earth used in aerospace and nuclear power and some magnetics, healthcare as well, I believe. It's the first heavy rare earth price outside of China. So these pricing is starting to develop. That was kind of in response to the export controls on 7 heavy rare earths and magnets that we saw back at the beginning of April. So these markets, the way things are changing and so on, there is now a cry for we need pricing that we can rely on that's outside of ex-China, that gives us a Western price. We've heard that in lithium for a really long time, haven't we? And now we're starting to see the rewards of that, with all of these developments on the pricing front. So it's a really interesting time. I can't give you stock advice and tell anyone, I would if I knew the right thing, I would not be a journalist. I'd be a very wealthy person, I'm sure. But I think that you just have to filter through because quite frankly, there are a lot of projects out there and you're going to have to see who's got the money in the bank and who's going to get the leg up from the in terms of financing and funding. But I'm very curious to see what starts to happen with some of the majors, whether they start to add more um, critical minerals to their bow and start to sort of look in other areas. So you might be mining lithium, but you're going to start to look at graphite, like Exxon. Are you going to be I don't know, a major company like Rio Tinto has started to really focus in on some of these other areas, BHP as well. Are they, and Glencore and so on, are they going to start to say, well, actually, we want to have like a, a minor metals division or a critical minerals division, or whatever they want to call it, where they start to look at antimony and gallium and all of these other things, rare earths possibly as well, and maybe there are a lot of, takeover targets out there as well. So I think it's gonna be a really interesting space because the last thing that they want to do is obviously start developing these projects from scratch, knowing how long they can take. I can imagine them coming in and saying, "Hey, we like the look of that project, here's a deal." So, I think it's gonna be really interesting. I think this acceleration of tariffs or export restrictions is just spurring diversification. Um, and it's got to happen, especially as not just because of the bans on exports of things like gallium and germanium and antimony and graphite to the US and export controls on other products whose names we couldn't say a few years ago, but because we don't produce them and we need to produce them and we need to have diversified supply chains. So there's a lot to do. It's just I like you said at the very beginning, my head's on a swivel trying to keep up at the moment, so it's really hard,
Yeah.
really hard.
Andrea, thank you very much for. I didn't tee up that opportunity on purpose for you to, plug all of those fast market pricing, but I know way back when Fastmarkets used to be called Industrial Metals or Industrial Materials as a company, right? And
But they
that's
had
what
a
these
division,
are.
industrial minerals, yeah,
Industrial
exactly.
minerals. So that's
Mhm.
hot, right? That's
Yeah,
sexy. Industrial minerals are sexy. I'm just so all of those it, I'm talking about mainstream and non-mainstream minerals. Actually, it's harder to make money in mainstream things because more people are following it. So if you is I'm not advising you not to look at the germanium market, or the antimony market. There could
right,
be fantastic opportunities there. It's just harder to find information. You don't
definitely.
have like an Albemarle, talking to the market every quarter about what's happening. And
Correct.
will Rio Tinto entered lithium? That was in a demonstration of the maturity of the industry, as I
Mhm.
was saying before. But you mentioned tech and others who are looking at tailings and other small markets. A lot of these companies are
Right.
doing this, but they're not huge markets. A lot of them they have defense applications. They're very neat. So it's really hard to become, you know, a $1 billion, mega $1 billion company, if the overall market size is really small. And we talk about rare earths. I mean, there's MP Materials and there's Linus as public equity plays who are producing. There are a few other, interesting stories out there, but the overall NDPR market is still relatively um, not huge, right?
No,
And I don't know
absolutely.
how fast it's growing, but the growth in lithium off of a decent sized base now, but the growth of nickel and copper are off of a much larger base. So these are these are I think very interesting metals. Graphite also, I agree with you, is interesting. It's just highly opaque. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
but
for
anyway,
sure.
we got to leave it, Andrew. We got to leave it there now. I really appreciate your taking the time to share your knowledge and what you've been doing here for Fast Markets, and look forward to seeing you in Las Vegas. And we'll catch up further then. And look forward to having your colleagues Will and Prez on next week to talk about lithium supply, demand, pricing, and these new derivatives contracts.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Andrea.